say now has weapons of mass destruction.
They're dialing up the rhetoric on Iraq. Let's see if we can nail them down, okay? Let's get to work.
We're working on a theory that the administration has already decided to go to war and is now focused on how to justify it.
It's not a theory.
That is a clip from the trailer for the 2017 film Shock and Awe. It shows how a group of journalists exposed major gaps in the Bush administration's justification for the Iraq War.
It's a situation worth examining as tensions rise between the U.S. and Iran. Some are questioning America's reasons for taking a more aggressive stance. Warren Strobel and Jonathan Landay are the focus of that film, along with their night editor, John Walcott. All three join us now. Jonathan Landay is a national security correspondent for Reuters. Warren Strobel is a national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And John Walcott is a contributing editor at Time magazine. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Good morning.
Pleasure.
Warren, you're a national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal. John, you are a contributing editor at Time magazine. Let's start with you, John. Many outlets leading up to the Iraq War got so much, there's so many things that was reported that was wrong. What was different about your approach at Night Raider?
I think the essential difference was the sources we used. We didn't rely just on the high-level people who had name recognition. Our sources, John's and Warren's in particular, were the mid-level people who had the greatest expertise in these matters and less political ambition, if I can put it that way.
So, listen, Warren, you sounded the alarm, letting people know, listen, this might not be all it's cracked up to be. There may not be sort of strong footing for the justification, but the invasion happened anyway. The war happened anyway. What were some of the forces at play that allowed people to sort of virtually ignore your reporting?
I think our reporting in the movie is sort of an example of swimming upstream. The other major news media, of course, did not report as we reported. The Bush administration, instead of trying to counter what we were reporting, just ignored us to try and not give us oxygen. And there were even times when our own newspapers, Night Raider newspapers, some of them declined to report or publish our stories because it was out of sync with what the New York Times and others were doing. So it was really, we were very lonely in a way.
Wow.
A lot of people have pointed to that era as one that was different than others because of 9/11, and there were some, perhaps reporters, perhaps editors, that were worried about seeming unpatriotic if they did not support the drumbeat of war. But we've been in periods like this before. There have been periods in the United States, for example, prior to World War II, where we were in similar situations. We didn't sort of see that same, that refrain of support for an administration that we saw in the period after 9/11 leading up to Iraq. Why do you think that is, Jonathan?
I can't answer the historical example that you brought up, but I can say that we simply did our job. I don't think extenuating 9/11, the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil. Obviously, it polarized some people, but that should not prevent journalists from doing their job. And there's a scene in the movie which is absolutely, virtually all of the movie is absolutely true. And at one point when John was giving us our assignment, he said something to the effect that the only question you need to ask is it true? When the administration says something, is it true? Beyond that, the other thing that got us going is the three of us have got extensive experience covering the Middle East, covering terrorism, and it made absolutely no sense when the Bush administration started trying to peddle the line that somehow Saddam Hussein was working with al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to perpetrate the 9/11 attack. That was just rang absolutely false, given that Saddam Hussein was exactly the kind of Arab authoritarian that Osama bin Laden and his network had vowed to overthrow, and so that kind of is that's kind of what got us started on the whole enterprise.
Okay, so now fast forward to now, and I think about asking the question of this administration: is it true? And you could sort of fill in the blank anywhere, but right now we're talking about what seemed like overnight tensions between Iran and the U.S. went from sort of a low simmer to almost a pre-boil. It felt like it happened over just a couple of weeks. Right. And now the question of is it true is being asked of some of our allies. They're asking that question. And we're getting sort of conflicting messages from people even within the administration. We have John Bolton, who's very hawkish, and he's like, we're going to send troops over to the Mideast. And then, and then some other members of the administration saying that, well, actually, things are simmering down a little bit. Can you guys, and this is going to be a big, broad question, but when you compare now and then, what do you see that is similar? What do you see that is definitely different and perhaps concerning?
Warren and I did a story, John and John, the three of us cooperated on a story last year on the propaganda offensive that the Trump administration launched to try and gin up its containment policy, its maximum pressure policy against Iran, that seemingly was also aimed at egging on protests over serious economic problems in Iran. And one of the similarities that we noticed was the fact that the U.S. propaganda was exaggerating some of the issues that it was using, that they were using, the administration has been using, to pressure Iran to try and win over European support and domestic support here in the United States, among which was the contention that the Iranians had been working closely with the Taliban, which is really pretty inaccurate. It's a very nuanced relationship, and there are other examples as well.
I guess I would argue that there are obviously a lot of similarities. There are what I call three main differences. One is you have a president now who clearly does not want a war, and his political base does not want a war, and that provides somewhat of a break on any move to war. You also have a situation where Iran is not Iraq. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, really presented a threat to Iraqi people and maybe its immediate neighbors, but Iran, unlike Iraq, has targeted Americans in Lebanon and Syria and elsewhere. So that makes, when you get these threat streams, that does make it a little bit different. I'm not saying that the administration is accurately portraying the intelligence, but Iran is not the same as Iraq.
There are a couple of, I think, obvious similarities. One of them is John Bolton,
right,
who was an advocate of invading Iraq and is now an advocate of overthrowing the regime in Iran. Mm-hmm. The second one is the allegation that somehow Al-Qaeda is aligned with Iran, which has a stark resemblance to the false allegation the Bush administration made that there was a link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Neither one of those is true. There are some Al-Qaeda members resident in Iran. Some of them are under house arrest, and there's absolutely zero evidence of any real collaboration between Shiite Iran and the Sunni extremist group, what's left of it, Al-Qaeda. In fact, there were Al-Qaeda members or members of Al-Qaeda's direct descendant, ISIS, who were fighting on the same side as American forces in Syria against, there were Iranian-backed forces fighting against ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. So Pompeo tried to float that, Secretary of State Pompeo tried to float that a couple of days ago, and it doesn't float.
It doesn't float. But John, going back to the point that was made earlier, the question that all journalists must ask when they're trying to hold a politician, an administration accountable, is it true? In an administration, in an era, as Anne-Marie pointed out, where there are so many instances where we know that what is coming from the administration or even from the tweet stream of the President of the United States is not true. and that they don't care. In other words, you've got to have, when you're questioning and you're holding a politician's feet to the fire, usually there's some kind of a response. Well, we don't want to present an image to the American people, or we don't want to be seen as lying to the American people, is usually how it works in a normal situation. But we're not living in normal times right now. So to young journalists out there, because what we've seen in the last couple of years, especially since the rise of President Trump's administration, is there are a lot more Washington-based political journalists covering this administration than there probably have ever been, at least in the modern era since Watergate. So what would you tell young journalists, all three of you, as they try to sort of parse what is happening, what is coming from the administration, knowing that even if you call them out and you say what they're saying is demonstrably false, that they don't really care about that?
Well, our job is not to care what they care about. The fact that this administration is different doesn't mean that journalism is different. Our job is still to hold those in power, not just in government, but in our economy, even in our social environment, accountable. And that hasn't changed at all.
I want to ask you guys another question, too, because I'm trying to remember how our allies acted when we were talking about the Iraq War versus what's happening now.
I was living in France. They were not on the side.
But here we have, very vocally some of our allies, including Britain, who almost immediately came out and said, well, I don't know what you're talking about, Secretary of State, but we don't have evidence to indicate there's a heightened threat at all. Very vocal, very public. That's a key difference. And I would think that's a difference that we should take heart in.
Well, don't forget, there is already a major division between the United States and its allies in Europe over the Trump administration's, President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. So the division was already there. And that withdrawal began, I think, or stimulated these concerns both among critics of the president as well as the allies in Europe, that the United States, that this administration was intent on picking a fight with Iran that could, in fact, result in armed conflict. And so those divisions were already there.
I would say, to put it in a nutshell, that the Bush administration went to war in Iraq with very limited support. There was Britain, there was Spain, there were a few countries in the developing world, Israel. President Trump, if he were to go to war in Iran, would have virtually no support. And part of that is because of the precedent of what happened almost 16 years ago.
Right.
And of which you three were part of just sort of shaping the narrative that ultimately proved to be correct, as opposed to a lot of other mainstream news organizations. Jonathan, Warren, John, thank you so much for sharing that insight with us. It's such an important subject, especially now in 2019. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks.